who's very fitting for the times that we live in, for the company that we run, and for where we're going in the future, in the months and years ahead. Not only at ERI, but with regards to the environment in this wonderful planet Earth that we've all had some time on. This gentleman, when you think about frequent flyer miles and things of that such, the gentleman I'm about to introduce has traveled himself 71 million miles. He's a very special human being. I'm going to show a little video, and then we're going to bring him up. But let's run that tape first, and then I'll give a little bit more about Ron Garan.
July 20th, 1969. At some level, I realized that we had just become a different species. We were a species no longer confined to our planet, and I wanted to be a part of that group of explorers. That, I think, started me on a journey of curiosity. I think it started me on a lifelong journey to be able to fulfill that dream of one day flying in space. Bill Anders, who took the famous Earthrise photograph, said, "We went all this way to explore the moon, and what we discovered in the process was the Earth." I remember when I looked out the window, I was hit with this sense of extreme gratitude. You know, gratitude for the opportunity to see the planet from that vantage point, and gratitude for the gift of the planet that we've been given. I mean, it is just absolutely, indescribably, breathtakingly beautiful. I'm on this space station that was built by 15 different nations that somehow found a way to set aside our differences and work together and build probably the most complicated, complex structure ever built, and build it in space. Imagine what we could do if we could take that same level of cooperation and bring it down to the Earth's surface. I think there is something that changed in me, and I think that thing that changed is my definition of the word home. Eventually, we smashed into the ground. And out of the window, I remember seeing a rock, a flower, and a blade of grass. I was home, but I was in Kazakhstan. Traveling away from our hometown or our nation or our planet gives us the opportunity to look back upon ourselves and to realize what we have always been. That realization is one of the most important things that we get from exploration.
So we figured, let's get a person, an astronaut, a real live astronaut, who's had a different perspective of the planet during his career, to share with us his thoughts, his wisdom of what he's seen during the 71 million miles and over 2,842 orbits that he's made around this beautiful planet that we've been tasked with protecting in the work that we do. He's written numerous books. His latest book, Floating in Darkness, A Journey of Evolution. He just came back from COP26. He's a fascinating guy and loves the planet as much as we do. And with no further ado, I'm going to introduce you now to our special guest speaker, Astronaut Ron Garan.
I'm really excited to speak to a group of people who are changing the world, and you are changing the world. So I want you all to imagine that you are on board the International Space Station, and you're looking out through the Earth-facing windows of the cupola, this windowed observatory on the bottom of the space station. And through the windows, you see our planet turning silently and slowly below you. Floating effortlessly there in that windowed observatory, you look out and you see thunderstorms casting long shadows across the horizon as you approach one of our 16 daily orbital sunsets. And as you approach that line below you, that line that separates day from night, you see the clouds change to pink and to red and to gray and finally black. And as you cross into the nighttime shadow of the Earth, you gasp as all the lights of the cities and towns, all the evidence of human activity, all of a sudden come to life. You see the paparazzi-like flashes of lightning storms. You experience dancing curtains of auroras that seem so close, it's as if you could reach out and touch them. I believe that seeing the planet from that vantage point, you would marvel at the thinness of our planet's atmosphere. And you'd be hit by the sobering realization that that paper-thin layer keeps every living thing on our planet alive. But I also think you'd be struck by the sobering contradiction between the beauty of our planet and the unfortunate realities of life on our planet for a significant number of her inhabitants. But I also think seeing the planet from that vantage point, seeing our world from that perspective, would fill you with hope. I think seeing what we can accomplish when we set aside our differences and work together, as evidenced by the International Space Station itself, would extend your optimism. Your definition of the word home would expand rapidly to encompass the planet in its entirety. And I think probably for the first time, you might fully understand what it means to be part of one human family. Now, obviously, you don't have to go to space to realize any of this. But traveling to space started me on a journey towards a deeper understanding of the beauty of our interconnected, interdependent fabric of life. Being physically separated, physically detached from the world, enabled me to become a detached witness to her beauty and splendor and unity. And so to start off our conversation, and I do want this to be a conversation, I want to talk about one specific image. I want to talk about NASA image designation AS8 142383. Now, I want to talk about that because that image changed my life, and it changed your life. In fact, it changed the entire course of human history. It, I believe, was an inflection point between two human epochs. I think it was the spark of an evolutionary phase shift where humanity was given the opportunity to transcend our humble beginnings and ascend to incomprehensible heights, both literally and figuratively. Now, images can change our perspective. They can change the way we see ourselves. And there's probably no image that changed the way we see ourselves more than NASA image designation AS8 142383. Now, the story begins on a December morning of December 21st, 1968, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, atop the tallest, the heaviest, the most powerful rocket ever brought to operational status, the Saturn V, sat the crew of Apollo 8. There was Commander Frank Borman, Command Module Pilot Jim Lovell, and Lunar Module Pilot Bill Anders. The aim of the mission was to become the first crewed spacecraft in history to travel to and orbit around the moon, and of course, to return to Earth safely. The inflection point came 3 days later when the crew of Apollo 8 came up from behind the far side of the moon on their fourth orbit, and they witnessed something never seen before by human eyes. Commander Borman was the first to see the amazing sight, and he called in excitement to the others, taking a black and white photo in the process. In the ensuing scramble, Bill Anders took a more famous color photograph, and it was all captured on the flight voice recorder.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, that's pretty. Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick.
Oh man, that's great.
Where is it? Quick.
As the crew experienced the Earth emerging from behind the lunar horizon, I wonder if they realized the significance of that moment. They had just become the first people in history to see the whole planet hanging in the blackness of space, and the first to capture that for the rest of us. This famous image, known as Earthrise, is probably the most influential photograph ever taken. This image revolutionized how we see the world, how we see ourselves, with its simple message that we are one people traveling on one planet towards one shared future. But I think for the most part, the meaning and the significance of this image has, for the most part, been forgotten. But back in 1968, for a brief moment, the world was one. People from all over the world, even in the Soviet Union, a nation that at the time was locked in a space race with the U.S. and a Cold War with the West, declared this a monumental achievement of all of humanity. For a brief moment, back in 1968, the world rallied around the image of Earthrise. In this breathtaking beauty is a deep heralding to the unity that we as a species are called to. But if we zoom into the microscopic details of this photograph, realizing that it was taken in 1968, we realize that not everything is as it seems. Apollo 8 came at the end of 1968, which was a year that was filled with much strife in the US and around the world. There was unrest in the streets, in Europe, in America, and there were a number of significant political assassinations around the world. And one of those assassinations was that of Dr. Martin Luther King. But exactly 1 year before the astronauts were hurtling through space on their way to the moon, Dr. King gave a sermon, the Christmas sermon on peace, which gives words to what Earthrise evoked.
It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality.
The interrelated structure of all reality. This isn't a cliche. This isn't a saying or philosophy. This is the reality of the world that we live in. This is fact. What will usher in a new human epoch is a better understanding of the basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. And so to illustrate this basic fact, I want to take you on a journey to space and back. July 20th, 1969 was my most vivid childhood memory, and was also the first moment where I realized that I wanted to be an astronaut. It was on that day where I, as a small boy, along with millions and millions of people all around the world, watched those first footsteps on the moon. Now, I don't think I would have been able to put it in these words at the time, but on some level, I realized, even at that age, that we had just become a different species. We were a species no longer confined to our planet. And I wanted to be a part of that group of explorers that got to step off our planet and look back upon ourselves. And that dream came true about 4 decades later when I launched into space on board Space Shuttle Discovery on the STS-124 mission. And I remember the day of launch, getting into our spacesuits, leaving the crew quarters and getting out to the Astro van, waving to everybody as we went out. We drove out to the launch pad, rode the elevator to the pointy end of the rocket, and then one by one, we climbed through the hatch and into our respective places on Discovery's flight deck there, and also on the mid-deck. And there we were. We're all laying our backs, strapped to 4.5 million pounds of explosives. And it's one of these wonderful moments that life gives you for self-reflection. And I briefly wondered what I was getting myself into. But right in front of me, right on Discovery's control panel, was a countdown timer. And as it counted down below 10 seconds, I got ready for the main engines to light. And you're going to hear what we were saying to each other as we launched.
QLS is go for main engine start. 6 seconds, main engine start. 3 coming up. 3 to 100. Hang on.
Booster ignition.
102.
Discovery.
Auto.
Mate Kudasai.
I see 3 at 104. I see a command and a roll. Houston, Discovery, roll program. I am LVLH.
Roger roll, Discovery.
Roger roll, Discovery.
Houston now controlling the flight of Discovery on man-made horizons.
Oh, what have you have to say? All right, good digitals.
So at 8.5 minutes after launch, all 3 engines shut down abruptly according to plan. And all of us went from being pushed into our seats at a force 3 times our weight, at 3 Gs, to being weightless instantly. And I remember thinking to myself, we made it. And by that, I realized that my childhood dream of flying in space had just come true. But that first day in space, I mean, it was an incredibly moving visual experience, but it was much, much more than just a visual experience. And as you heard in the opening video, what I experienced in space was a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to see the planet from this perspective and for the gift of the planet that we've all been given. And in some way, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully explain. Being physically detached from the Earth made me feel deeply interconnected and deeply interdependent with everyone on it. From space, I was able to look back and see what we have always been, one single human family with a common origin, and a shared future. And this is an awareness that I did not always have. I was born in the year that Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. 50 years later, almost to the day, from the very same launch pad that Yuri Gagarin launched from, I launched into space with a couple of Russian military officers on a spacecraft called Gagarin. And as we stood at the base of the rocket that would take us to space on a cold April evening from a previously top-secret Soviet military installation, I looked up at the top of the rocket and I saw an American flag and a Russian flag side by side. And that image was burned into me. And I get choked up just thinking about it right now, because I spent the first 15 years of my adult life training to fight the Russians. I was a Cold War fighter pilot stationed on the tip of the sword in the former West Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I fought in combat in another part of the world where I saw firsthand the horrors of war. Back then, I was operating in a two-dimensional us versus them world. Now, this is the image of our world that our civilization is currently based on. It's a two-dimensional landscape of nation-states fighting and competing over resources and ideologies. It's a landscape where not only nations compete, but NGOs, corporations, special interest groups, political parties, and this is the real world. This is the image taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts over 50 years ago. This image proclaims the fact that each and every one of us is riding through the universe together on the spaceship that we call Earth. From this vantage point, you can't see national boundaries. All you can see is the fragile oasis of our home planet Earth. So let's look back again at this two-dimensional image. What we need to understand is that this is something that we created, but we didn't create it based on the reality of our world. This is the guidepost of the old human epoch. And it may have been appropriate. It may have been appropriate before we realized how interconnected and interdependent we all are. It may have been appropriate before we realized that humans could destroy the very life support systems of our planet. And it may have been appropriate when nation states could operate in relative isolation. Now, I'm not saying we should do away with nation states. What I am saying is that this is no longer the appropriate guidepost for our actions. This is the appropriate guidepost for our action. This is reality. In order for humanity to progress and prosper, we need to tackle and deal with the very real challenges and problems facing us in the context of the real world. We need to enter into a new human epoch and build a future that's based on the image of Earthrise. A foundational part of the building and construction of this future is business enterprise. Businesses, the decisions that we're making in our businesses right now, have the incredible power to either destroy our planet by clinging to the two-dimensional mindset of the old human epoch, an epoch that is obsessed with conquest and competition and profit maximization and growth at all costs. Or business enterprise can save it by embracing Earthrise and ushering in a new human epoch that's based on three key tenets: interdependence, long-term thinking, and profound collaboration, all wrapped in the blanket of empathy and compassion. We cannot continue as a species with a two-dimensional map as our model. The principles of Earthrise will lead to a positive, restorative future, a future where a stabilized human population can live within the planetary limits of Earth in harmony with the planet and with harmony with each other, a future that we would all want to be a part of. During my 6 months in space, I got into a routine where I would almost say goodnight to the Earth. When my task was over, my day was over, I'd go to the cupola, this windowed observatory, and I would just gaze at the planet for a little while. And as I would look at the planet and just bask in this beauty, I would think about our future. I think about the next 50 years. How far would we progress in overcoming the challenges and the problems facing our planet? Now, I launched into space with a belief that we already, right now, have all the resources, all the technology necessary to solve many, if not all, the problems facing our planet. And so I spent a good deal of my time Earth gazing, pondering the question, if this is true, why do they still remain? The seeds to the answer to that question were planted 3 years earlier on my first space flight. On the third spacewalk of that mission, my feet were clamped to the end of the space station's robotic arm. And with me attached to the arm, it was flown through a maneuver that we called the windshield wiper, which took me across a large arc across the top of the space station and back. So at the top of this arc, I was about 100 feet above the space station, looking down at this enormous, massive complex against the backdrop of our indescribably beautiful planet 250 miles below. And the sheer beauty of that scene took my breath away. But more compelling than the beauty was the amazing human accomplishment that the space station represents. It's arguably the most complicated, complex structure ever built. It was built in space. It was built in space by 15 different nations. Now, these nations, as we all know, weren't always the best of friends. Some were on opposite sides of the Cold War, opposite sides of the space race. Some fought wars against each other. Some fought wars against each other and purposely targeted each other's civilians in an effort to break each other's will. But somehow, these nations found a way to set aside fear, set aside their differences, and do this amazing thing in space. And I wondered, as I hovered there above the space station, what would the world look like right now? How many fewer problems and challenges would we face if we could figure out how to have that same level of cooperation, and bring it down to the Earth's surface? Now, in addition to greater cooperation, we also need to properly frame the problems that we're facing. And so in my work in sustainable development, I at times became frustrated with how we keep trying to deal with things like global warming, deforestation, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss as standalone issues, when in reality, they're mere symptoms of the underlying root problem. The problem is that we don't see ourselves as planetary. And so what do I mean when I say planetary, and why planetary and not global? Well, we don't live on a globe. Global is our financial networks, it's our computer networks, it's abstract lines covering a sphere. When I looked out the window of the International Space Station, I saw an iridescent biosphere teeming with life. I didn't see the economy. So our economy is a subset of society, which in turn is a subset of the biosphere of our planet. That means that our global economy is the wholly owned subsidiary of the biosphere, not the other way around. But since our political and business systems put the complete focus on growing the economy at all costs, and since our human-made systems treat everything, including the very life support systems of our planet, as the wholly owned subsidiary of the global economy, it's obvious from the vantage point of space that we're living a lie. We need to move from thinking economy, society, planet to planet, society, economy. Our economy is dependent on our society, and our society is dependent on and embedded in our biosphere. And we need to reorganize and reprioritize these systems, not out of any ideology or eco-philosophy, but rather because that's the reality of the world that we live in. And so, because we're all riding through the universe together on this spaceship that we call Earth, it should make you wonder about the life support systems of our planet. And so right now, Spaceship Earth does not have a closed life support system. That means that we are using up resources faster than they're being replenished, which also means that on our current trajectory, there will come a time, guaranteed, where we will run out of the resources necessary to sustain life on our planet. And ERI is doing a really good job of helping us to reduce the amount of non-renewable resources that we're using up. But companies also need to figure out ways to decouple their business operations from constrained and limited resources. Those companies that do not take a sustainable business approach and are overly focused on the short term versus the long term are going to see themselves at a massive disadvantage as key resources in their value chain become more and more scarce. Now, this is not only a way for us to ensure that future generations will have the resources they need, it's also good business now. And we've got to get away from this mindset that when we're done with something, we just bury it in the ground and forget about it. And that's why what you guys are doing here is so very, very important. So I want you to imagine that in the year 2022, we finally figured out how to come together, and businesses and corporations and nations and grassroots efforts all came together and figured out how to usher in a new human epoch, an epoch where businesses exist first and foremost to serve the needs of civilization, where businesses are not seen as independent, discrete entities operating in a solely self-serving vacuum, but they're seen as interdependent nodes in a fabric of prosperity where everybody has the chance to live a good life in harmony with each other and with our planet. A new epoch where political and business leaders take a long-term, multi-generational view on investment and on progress. So in order for us to reach this new epoch, we also need to expand our vocabulary. And so to illustrate that, I want to share with you the story of my return to Earth. When my 6-month mission was over, my 2 Russian crewmates and I got into our spacesuits, we got into our Soyuz spacecraft, we closed the hatch, we undocked from the space station, and we did a couple of laps around our planet. And as we crossed to the south tip of South America, we fired our engines to enter the atmosphere. I remember seeing this crescent moon go by the window. We had this fiery, violent ride through the atmosphere at 5 miles a second. The parachutes opened, they threw us all over the place. Eventually, we smacked into the ground. And we hit so hard that we bounced, and that was in slow motion, by the way. And we bounced and we rolled, and we flipped over. And now my window was pointed down at the ground. And out of my window, I saw a rock, a flower, and a blade of grass. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm home. And what was really interesting about that thought, and I realized this right away, is I was home, but I was in Kazakhstan. So to me, at that moment, my home wasn't just Houston, Texas, where at the time my family was waiting for me to return. My home was Earth. And our definition of that word home, when we expand it, it doesn't come with a requirement that we forget where we came from, our national, our political, our religious, our cultural identities. It simply means seeing those things in the context of the bigger picture. And in the context of the bigger picture, I want to thank all of you for what you're doing and what you will do to help make life on our planet as beautiful as our planet looks from space. You don't have to be in orbit to have the orbital perspective, and by working together, we don't have to accept the status quo on our planet. So let's nudge the trajectory of our society towards a more sustainable, more just, more beautiful future. So thank you.